Soon after President Zachary Taylor's death in 1850, conspiracy theories speculated that perhaps he was assassinated by political enemies. These theories grew and evolved over the next 140 years until his body was exhumed and tested in order to uncover the truth. I'm Bob Summers, and this is a presidential story. General Zachary Taylor had never revealed his political leanings while in the Army. He was apolitical and had negative opinions of most politicians. In fact, he had never even voted before. You can hear that story in episode 23, which is linked above and in the description below. Taylor was more aligned with the Whig Party, but had an independent mind. He believed in a strong national banking system, that secession was not how to resolve national disputes, and took a stand against the expansion of slavery, which surprised many at the time since Taylor was himself a slave owner. While the Compromise of 1850 was being negotiated, both parties in Congress ignored and bypassed Taylor because of his independent positions. In his last days, Taylor's administration was overshadowed by the Galphin affair, which involved two of his cabinet members and a $100,000 payment from the U.S. Treasury, or about $4 million today, made by Treasury Secretary William Meredith to Secretary of War George Crawford. The public was outraged, the House of Representatives censured Taylor, and newspapers of both parties began to call for his impeachment. All this to say, Taylor didn't have many friends in Washington. On July 4, 1850, Taylor attended Independence Day celebrations during a fundraising event at the site of the Washington Monument, which was currently under construction. According to several sources, Taylor consumed a very large quantity of ripe cherries and iced milk. On this very hot day, after spending a lot of time in the sun listening to speeches at the fundraiser, Taylor went for a walk along the Potomac River. When he arrived back at the Executive Mansion, what we now call the White House, he drank many glasses of ice water to quench his thirst and rehydrate. That night, Taylor suffered from severe stomach cramps and became seriously ill. The president's Army physician, Alexander Witherspoon, diagnosed Taylor with cholera morbus, a flexible mid-19th century term for intestinal ailments as diverse as diarrhea and dysentery, but not necessarily the cholera bacteria, which swept through the U.S. in the late 1840s and 1850s, and took the life of former President James K. Polk in 1849. Taylor's symptoms included severe cramping, diarrhea, nausea, and dehydration. To treat him, his doctors prescribed ipecac, which induces vomiting, and calomel, also known as mercury chloride, which is a toxic laxative, neither of which would help a patient who is severely dehydrated. They also prescribed opium and quinine, plus they bled and blistered the president. Unsurprisingly, Taylor's condition did not improve. Taylor ate slivers of ice for relief until his body began rejecting fluids altogether. On July 8th, Taylor remarked to a medical attendant, "I should not be surprised if this were to terminate in my death." On the morning of July 9th, Taylor called to his wife, Margaret, and asked her not to weep, saying, "I have always done my duty. I am ready to die. My only regret is for the friends I leave behind me." After 4 days of suffering, at 10:35 p.m. on July 9th, from the Executive Mansion, President Zachary Taylor took his last breath. He was 65 years old and had only been president for 16 months. Vice President Millard Fillmore took the presidential oath of office the next morning. Margaret Taylor was so grief-stricken that she was unable to stand or walk without assistance. While her husband's funeral was taking place in the East Room of the Executive Mansion on July 13th, she remained sequestered in the upstairs family quarters. She would leave the White House that night. 2 weeks later, she left Washington for good and never mentioned the White House again. Taylor's final resting place was in Louisville, Kentucky. Today, the site is known as the Zachary Taylor National Cemetery and Monument. Some historians have held that Taylor died from heat stroke. Others blame his death on gastroenteritis caused by a lethal combination of acidic cherries with iced milk. According to Taylor's doctors, his official cause of death was cholera morbus. The cholera bacteria, which was common during the sweltering Washington summers, could have been ingested through the milk, which was not pasteurized at the time, or the water, which was generally foul and unsanitary. Even though several of Taylor's cabinet members had come down with a similar illness, rumors that Taylor had been poisoned immediately began to circulate after his death. Common suspects were pro-slavery Southerners, or Catholics. A few weeks after Taylor's death, President Fillmore received a letter alleging that Taylor had been poisoned by a Jesuit lay official. In 1881, John Bingham, well known for serving as the Judge Advocate General at the Lincoln assassination trial, wrote an editorial in the New York Times alleging that Jefferson Davis had poisoned Taylor. In the late 1980s, author and professor Clara Rising had a theory that Taylor had been poisoned by arsenic. She convinced Taylor's closest living descendants, his 4 times great-grandchildren, to allow his body to be exhumed, although some of the relatives claim they never thought or discussed that Taylor may have run into foul play. They agreed to the exhumation for the sake of history. On June 17, 1991, 141 years after Taylor's death, Taylor's remains were exhumed and transported to the office of the Kentucky Chief Medical Examiner. Although Taylor had not been embalmed, samples of his hair, all 10 fingernails, some bone, and other tissues were removed and sent to 3 different labs, including Tennessee's Oak Ridge National Laboratory, where neutron activation analysis was conducted. The remains were then returned to the mausoleum with appropriate military honors. 9 days later, on June 26th, Kentucky's Chief Medical Examiner George Nichols reported his findings. Taylor had the same levels of arsenic as would be expected in any living person. The amount of arsenic needed to kill him would need to be hundreds of times higher. He was also not poisoned by mercury, lead, or other toxic metals, such as those that were used in the medicine used to treat Taylor. According to Nichols, Taylor's death was a result of any of a myriad of natural diseases which could have produced the symptoms of gastroenteritis. He also added that any potential for recovery was hampered by his doctor's treatment. Thanks for watching.